So today, let's talk about Ukraine. Now, I've heard a lot of videos from a lot of people that say they know what they're talking about, but either number one, they're deliberately lying, or number two, they don't have enough expertise or life experience to understand that they're passing on the conclusions of others, and they have no understanding of the raw data behind those conclusions, which in many cases are not factual. We know the two possibilities everybody talks about in Ukraine. One, Ukraine winning, and number two, Russia winning. But the third path is one nobody discusses, and that is path number three, the partition of Ukraine. At this point in time, the best strategic outcome for the West is the actual partition of Ukraine. And the reason I say that is, number one, it maintains the world order. Number two, it prevents escalation into World War III. And my personal belief is it just puts off World War III until a future time rather than current times. So let's look at possibility number three. So if the areas taken and incorporated into Russia through their statements are partitioned and become part of Russia, while the remainder of Ukraine becomes an independent Ukraine that's assigned to NATO, that would do the most to maintain current world order and de-escalate the situation. The reason I say that is the bulk of the mineral wealth of the country, the lithium, the fertilizer production, and the ag production remains with NATO. The reason this is important is all of the food, the fertilizer, the oil, the mineral wealth, the lithium, that does two things. One, it stabilizes Europe. The second thing is it stabilizes Africa. If the West loses Ukraine, they're pretty much going to lose Africa, because Ukraine is the biggest player in feeding Africa from both a grain standpoint and fertilizer standpoint. Let's talk about the current military situation in Ukraine. Everybody's talking about the providing of Leopard 2, Abrams tanks, and the Challenger series of tanks from England. These are all late generation. The British one and the American one's actually a heavy tank, where the Leopard is a main battle tank. These tanks are complicated. Only the export versions of these tanks can be given to Ukraine, because there's classified systems, materials, software on these tanks that are in use by NATO that they don't want Russia to have. The reason the timeline is so long in delivering these tanks is they have to put the stockpile tanks into export status, or they have to make them from tanks that are in reserve. So for instance, on the M1 Abrams, a lot of the electronics, the sighting systems, and the armor are all classified. So the export version of the Abrams that's used in a lot of countries doesn't have the uranium, depleted uranium armor that's in the US version. So conventional armor plating is used on the export version. So you would have to disassemble portions of the tank, reassemble them with the lesser armor before they can be exported. Same thing happens with the other NATO tanks. There are certain aspects of them that have to be removed and replaced with the export versions of the electronic and sighting packages. If NATO really wanted to surge the forces of Ukraine, there's a real easy and cheap way to do it. Nobody talks about the Leopard 1 tank and the M60 series of tanks from the US and the upgraded M48 tanks. There are thousands of those held in reserve in NATO. A lot of them actually were bought by surplus dealers and they're in storage. They all use the 105, which is a British manufactured tank gun that the US adopted in all of NATO. So these tanks all use 105 millimeter main guns rather than the 120 millimeter smoothbore guns that are common in NATO. Older British tanks such as the Chieftain use a rifled 120 millimeter gun. Those could also be exported. Some of those were actually found in Iraq during the war there. Now, the other thing I'd like to add is everybody seems to see that there's a controversy with using depleted uranium ammunition and supplying it with the Abrams, the Leopard 2, and also the British Challenger. Now, what all the fools that are saying this don't understand is the Russians went to depleted uranium as a standard issue tank ammunition for 115 and 125 millimeter guns in 1982. So depleted uranium ammunition has been in use in the war in Ukraine the entire time. So when we look at these other older tanks that use the 105, they also have depleted uranium available for them. So what a lot of countries do is they have an export version of tank ammunition that uses tungsten carbide, tungsten beryllium, and that way they control the issuance of depleted uranium ammo because they don't want other countries to have that performance. Since Russia's been using DU the entire time, and you can bet that the Ukrainian Army is using captured DU ammunition against the Russians, the issuance of DU ammunition doesn't escalate anything. And if we rely on the Leopard 1 and the M60 and the M48 upgrade that use a 105, tungsten carbide and DU ammunition is also available for them. So this is actually a non-factor. So right now there are thousands of tanks and other obsolete armored vehicles that actually match the capacity of the T-62, T-64, and T-72, which are the most common tanks in use by the Russians. A volume of 1,000 tanks moved into Ukraine, supplement the Ukrainian Army, has a mass nature to it. So the quality may not be equivalent to the current tanks in use by NATO, but the overwhelming majority of these tanks used in wooded terrain and also in the fields in that area, they offer better flotation because most of them are lighter. You can put Grouser tracks on them very easily to give them capabilities in mud and snow. And I can remember when the M60 was in service, I had to go down to Lejeune and Bragg and replace some of the bridges when they went from M60s to M1 Abrams because of the weight difference. So these are things to consider. And the cost of a Leopard 1 tank that is operational and in surplus right now is between $80,000 and $100,000 rather than $5 to $6 million. So a volume purchase could bring that even down below $50,000 a tank. I know for a fact there are a lot of Leopard 1 tanks sitting in the Netherlands and in Belgium right now that are available. So what is the reality of the situation? It seems to me if the powers that be really wanted to win in Ukraine, they would put all this into action and move forward with the obsolete equipment. Please share your thoughts. We'll see you on the next video.